In our second lecture now on this Christian history series, we want to take a look for a second part at this period known as the early church. We've already discussed how we've divided in these first period two different divisions. The Apostolic Church, AD 33. Now that's just, I would say from the ascension of Jesus, right? From Acts chapter 1 to the death of the Apostle John. We don't have exact, precise dates for those events, but we just say approximately AD 33 to AD 100. And then we come in this period that we call the early church, which covers the period from AD 100 until the period of 312, which we would consider to be the conversion of Constantine and how things radically changed for Christians in the Roman Empire, and therefore for Christianity at the conversion of Constantine, which we'll discuss in some length. So in this period of the early church, we discussed how Christians met and worshipped in the period of the early church. Then we discussed persecution against Christians in the period of the early church. And then now thirdly, we want to talk about another important theme or characteristic through this period, and that would be the spread of the gospel. The spread of the gospel, as remarkable as it was during the period of the Apostolic Church, we would say that it was even more remarkable during this period of the early church. We sort of took a look at a map before of first century churches and how it covered a lot of the Roman Empire, but not the western part of the Roman Empire into what's known as the Iberian Peninsula, that would be Spain and Portugal, into Gaul, which today we would call France, up into Britain, and up over into the western part of North Africa. Those periods were largely untouched by the gospel during the time of the Apostolic Church, but the gospel spread into those regions in a radical way during the period of the early church. So the Apostolic Church had its parameters, and then the early church had a much greater parameter, with churches extending all the way up north into Cologne. Now the city where I live in right now is Siegen, Germany. It's about on the same latitude as Cologne. Let me tell you, that's a good 8-hour drive. That's 800 kilometers from here. It's a long way north. There were churches in Cologne this far up in the Roman Empire. And so you see how the church spread all up north, all over west, into North Africa, into the area of Spain, and then also eastward also was a greater expansion. Since Christianity began in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, it generally spread westward up to the boundaries of the empire. For 350 years, the Rhine and the Danube were the borders of the Roman Empire. The Romans kept about 200,000 troops on this frontier of the Danube and the Rhine. And those two rivers formed a wonderful natural border that basically encompassed the boundaries of the Roman Empire. In the ancient world, the people who lived east of the Rhine and north of the Danube were generally known as barbarians. That's because the Greeks called all foreigners barbarai, meaning people who were strange, foreign, or crude, especially in the way that they spoke. The term implied inferiority to Greco-Roman culture. And so that's what they thought of all these people who lived in this area east of the Rhine and north of the Danube. They considered them inferior barbarians. But yet these people did have civilized and developed cultures. The German tribes in particular had high standards of morality and duty that Romans, such as Tacitus, admired. Yet these barbarians saw the high cultural, economic, and agricultural development of the Roman Empire, and they wanted it for themselves. I mean, these weren't stupid people who lived outside of the Roman Empire, and when they learned of the great accomplishments of the Roman Empire, they wanted it for themselves as well. So it wasn't until late in the early church period that the gospel spread beyond the Roman Empire into the west and the north. Between 250 and 300, Christianity began to spread among a Germanic tribe known as the Visigoths. So the Visigoths raided cities in Asia Minor, down here in the area that we would call modern-day Turkey. They raided cities in Asia Minor, and some of these prisoners that they took were Christians. The witnesses of these unwilling missionaries introduced the gospel to the Visigoths and to the German peoples. Now, towards the north and the west, the gospel made its way all the way to northern England. We don't know much about how the gospel first came to England, but at the Council of Arles in 314, there were British bishops present at that council, which shows that not only was Christianity present in the Great Britain at that time, but that it was also organized. From the Roman perspective, what an anonymous Christian wrote in the letter to Diogenes was true, and we already took one look at a section from that letter of Diogenes before. Here's another section. He says, to put it simply, the soul is to the body what Christians are to the world. The soul is spread through all parts of the body, and Christians through all cities of the world. So, basically, Christianity filled up the Roman Empire, which it had not done in the apostolic period, but that it definitely did do during the early church period, and it even extended beyond the Roman Empire, spreading the gospel as far as India. India in the east have reasonably reliable traditions that say that the Apostle Thomas came to Kraganor in AD 52 and founded 7 churches there. They say that he then went to the eastern coast of India and beyond and was martyred at Mylapore, which is the modern city of Madras, in the year 72. And so the gospel expanded eastward all the way to India and beyond. It also expanded down into Ethiopia to the south. And so you just see the spreading phenomenon of the gospel during this period. Now again, I would say that during this period, most of the missionary effort was not deliberate. Most of the spread of the gospel was spontaneous. Do you remember what I told you about how the gospel came to the Visigoths? How did it come to the Visigoths? The Visigoths were down in Asia Minor, raping and pillaging towns, and they carried off a couple Christian servant girls, and the Christian servant girls went back and testified and, brought people among the Visigoths to Christ, and that's how the gospel came to the Germanic peoples. So, much of the missionary endeavor during this period was not deliberate. It was just done through the personal lives of Christians, which, by the way, can sometimes be an enormously effective missionary strategy, right? Just go, move to an area, and be a Christian, right? You don't necessarily have to be a full-time Christian servant. You don't necessarily have to quit your job or all this. Sometimes it can be an extremely effective missionary strategy to have no missionary strategy. But just go and live in a different place, but say, I'm going to live my daily life here as a genuine Christian. And God can use that in a mighty way. Obviously, He has in times past. So the other thing I want you to understand is the role of what we would call geography during this period of the early church. Geography actually had a very important influence, especially when we consider the patriarchal cities and the rise of the Roman bishop. Now, in the days of the apostles, churches were governed by the influence of the apostle. Sometimes this was direct, as in the case of Paul, right? When Paul was at Ephesus, at the church there, who ran the church at Ephesus? Paul, right? There was never any doubt about that. But sometimes the apostolic influence was indirect. When Paul left Ephesus, he left Timothy in charge of it, right? And so Timothy wasn't one of the apostles, but he was certainly under the influence, under the direction of the apostles. But what's very interesting to see is that in the early church period, the office of apostle was not recognized as it was in the apostolic church. In other words, we don't see people coming on the scene in the early church period who claim to be apostles. If you were to ask a Christian or a church leader in the early church period, where are the apostles? They would answer, back in the first days of the church. Early church leaders